I find self-heal so helpful when you want to have that action in a formula of getting things dispersed and broken up and moving and cleared.
Hello and welcome to the Herbs with Rosalee podcast, a show exploring how herbs heal as medicine, as food, and through nature connection. I'm your host, Rosalee de la Forêt. I created this YouTube channel to share trusted herbal wisdom so that you can get the best results when relying on herbs for your health. I love offering up practical knowledge to help you dive deeper into the world of medicinal plants and seasonal living. Each episode of the Herbs with Rosalee podcast is shared on YouTube as well as your favorite podcast app. Transcripts and recipes for each episode can be found at herbswithrosaleepodcast.com or through the link in the video description. Also in the video description, you'll find other helpful resources. For example, to get my best herbal tips, as well as fun bonuses, be sure to sign up for my weekly herbal newsletter. Okay, grab your cup of tea and let's dive in. From the beginning of this podcast, I knew I didn't want this to be simply a list of medicinal uses. Instead, I wanted to dive deeper into how herbs heal through medicine, through food, and by strengthening our connection to nature. My interview with Richard weaves together all of these themes in a beautiful way. It was truly a pleasure to chat with him, and I especially loved his advanced view of herbal energetics and self-heal. This episode was really insightful. I have no doubt I'll be listening to it again myself. Well, for those of you who don't already know him, Richard Mandelbaum has been an avid student of our native flora for close to 40 years. He has been practicing as an herbalist since 1999, blending Chinese and Western herbal traditions with a private practice online and in person in the Southern Catskills of New York. In addition, he teaches classes in clinical herbal medicine, phytochemistry, medicine making, field botany, and foraging. He is co-founder of the Arbor Vitae School of Traditional Herbalism and is on the faculty at David Winston Center for Herbal Studies and the Wan Institute of Graduate Studies. He has been an AHG registered herbalist since 2003 and served on the AHG Board of Directors from 2012 to 2018, serving as Secretary and Chair of the Committee for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. Richard lives with his wife, Gabrielle, and his daughter, Rose, in their straw bale home in Forestburg, New York. Welcome to the show, Richard.
Thank you so much. I'm super happy to be here.
Well, I'm thrilled to have you here. I don't know if you'll remember this, but I was a student in one of your classes at International Herb Symposium. I can't remember when, like years ago. Wasn't the last one, maybe the time before that or the time before that. I don't remember. And I didn't tell you this before we went on air that I'm about to be your student again because I was just accepted at the David Winston program. So,
oh, wonderful.
I'm looking forward to it. So,
yeah, that's wonderful. I just to say, like David's program, and I'm sure we can talk more about that, but one thing that's like interesting and engaging about it for me as one of the teachers is that it in the mix of people who are newer to herbalism, it also attracts people who really already know what they're doing and are in it and just want to learn more from his perspective and from the school's perspective. And so that's actually like wonderfully engaging for me. So I look forward to that. I'm happy to hear that.
Yeah, I'm excited. I think for me, I love being a student. I love being in a learning environment. I just feel like there's so much inspiration there. And there's, as anybody who studies herbs knows, there's always more to learn. So I'm really excited for all of that. So, and I'm looking forward to your teachings as well. I've enjoyed being your student in the past. So it's going to be exciting.
Well, thank you so much for that.
Yeah. I don't really know about your backstory and how you got on the plant path, so I'm excited to hear that, Richard.
Yeah, so I'm here talking to you from my underwater chamber here. We have a little video blurriness, but yeah, I mean, would you like me to just dive in anywhere on that? I mean, it's such a big question, but I'm happy to just babble for you if you like.
I am. This is I love hearing about everyone's plant path because I feel like for me, at least me, and I hope for the listeners, there's always something there that like resonates and like there's this commonality of how the plants have called us. together. And so it's always interesting to see, what threads have pulled you in.
I so much agree. It's something I say often, that it's just fascinating among herbalists and the herbal community to ask people, how did you get here? And it's always interesting with anybody to ask that kind of question, right? Just to know somebody's path. But with herbalism, I think because we're such like a motley crew of stray animals in a way. It's like we're feral cats and stray dogs wandering around. It's even more interesting because, as you know, and you talk to people all the time, some people come at it from a healthcare background or from their own health challenges, or as you're alluding to, for me, it's very much like it is for a lot of us, the plants giving me ultimately no choice. It's like, you're doing this, and it's a matter of how long it took me to realize it, or to
Mhm.
listen properly.
Oh my gosh, I have goosebumps. That is like has definitely been my experience. That is so true.
Absolutely, absolutely, and it's funny because so I'll dig in and answer your question more directly, I promise. But sometimes people ask me, like, what do I like to do on my free time? And one of the things I most like to do is just get outside and be with the plants. It's not like I want to do something different from my day job, right? So
Mhm.
it's a privilege, it's a blessing. It's so fortunate to be able to be on a path like this. And in any event, to talk a little bit about my own story, like I think a lot of us, I was an oddball teenager. I won't put you on the spot to ask if you were, but I could guess. and I, looking back on it, I think that I just was realizing on some level how empty I, there there was a space inside, right? There was a hole inside that wasn't being filled, and living in such a materialistic culture, I think we all feel that, honestly. And some people either become more self-aware of it. Some people are more privileged to be able to act on it. Some people don't have that ability or option as much. But I think that was there for me. And as like 14, 15, 16 years old, that kind of age when so much is changing. My daughter's that age now. So like everything, the whole universe is changing. Um, uh, just realizing that and just seeking, right? Seeking. And so reading a lot of Buddhist sutras and the Bhagavad Gita and philosophy and poetry and writing poetry and finding solace in the world around me, and meaning the natural, non-human world. And I also went through something very traumatic at that age, and difficult and challenging. And again, looking back on it, there's just no doubt in my mind that this is what helped me get through that and continues to. And part of that journey for me was finding a real joy in embracing my curiosity about the world. It's like learning the birds and learning the constellations and the names of the stars, and then the plants, of course, and the trees. And really started with me with the trees, and just learning with crappy field guides that I found, to start to identify the trees around me, in growing up in New Jersey, like not having grown up with anything like this at all. And so it really started with, words are always limiting, right? Like they don't really express what we have to say. So I'll say with botany, um, but with learning to identify the plants, and starting with the trees and going from there. And one thing for me, I think is true, but I share with students too, particularly when I teach botany, is I feel like that is the first step towards reestablishing intimacy with the
Hmm.
plant world and then with the planet more broadly than that. I kind of liken it to like you and I could conceivably get to know each other without recognizing each other or knowing each other's names, but it would be very strange and more awkward and challenging than it needs to be. So like a first step, like, hey, we share each other's names, right? Like that's what you do when you meet another person. And I feel like with the plants, it's the same thing. So botany for me, meaning being able to recognize, oh, hello, I know who you are, is a foundation for me, at least, as it is with a lot of herbalists. But again, herbalists come at it from different angles, and that's all good as it should be. Um, but that led me for many years, just as like this parallel part of my life. Um, Going out on my own, it was actually many years before I found anybody else who, or stumbled across anybody else, probably a better way to describe it, who like to do that kind of thing. And I had just been teaching myself that whole time, which is a horribly inefficient way to learn botany, by the way. But it was a labor of love, and just many, many hours. And it's funny because I didn't even know if I knew anything until I ran into other people who had a background, or when I finally started hanging out with botanists, it's like I think I know a lot, but maybe I'm wrong about everything. so so got some affirmation that way. In any event, that kind of never at for quite a few years never gelled into something that I realized would be a life path. It was really just like, what do I want to do to ground myself and to satisfy my curiosity, and to re-engage with the world around me on my free time. And that kind of led me, like as you can imagine it would, to foraging, right? Because once you know a lot of plants, then you start reading like, oh, I could eat that. I know that plant. That's interesting. Let me go back out and get some. And so getting into foraging, and then being interested in growing, and learning how to garden, interning at or on organic farms and things like that, and learning how to grow. And for a while thought maybe that's the direction I would go in, is growing. And kind of parallel to all this, not to diverge, but also was very involved in food justice and sustainable and organic agriculture movements. And so it all kind of was sort of going together for me. And with the medicinal part, with plants as medicine, that came later. So I'm lucky in a sense that this all started when I was younger. So I'm talking now about my mid-20s or so, but kind of stumbling across the the depth of herbal medicine as you know it, as I know it, like that. But that until you know it, you don't. I'm sure you have students where it's like, oh my God, I didn't realize it goes this deep, right? And we've all had that moment. And so, at least those of us who didn't grow up with it, and I didn't, and it was a road trip to an herbal gathering. I don't know if this predates you, but Frontier Herbs used to have an herbal gathering conference, if you want to call it that, out in the cornfields in Iowa. Um, and I was living in Arkansas at the time, and a few of us took a road trip up there, and just uh, got to see some real live herbalists talking and doing their thing. And just that was, the moment, so to speak, where I realized, oh my God, I think I know where this is all going. Um,
Hmm.
um, and David Winston was one of those teachers, so I ended up
Really?
going back to New Jersey and studying with him, and again involved in food justice movement and other things at the time too. But yeah, anyway, that's sort of
That must have been a very exciting conference, like life changing, paradigm shifting. Like, Your life diverged after that. Well, maybe continued on the same path, but deeper. But
yeah, clarified, right? Like solidified, like because it all felt like, I'm here, and then it's like, this is where I am, and absolutely, yeah, absolutely, and it definitely was life changing. I can say that, and motivating and exciting, and yeah, all of that for sure.
and so your first like real introduction to herbal medicine was through David Winston's program.
Yeah, and it was interesting because I knew a lot of plants at that point. So it was
Mhm.
funny because I was in a class, and of course, this is back in the previous millennium, and and which I like to say because it's funny to say, but it's true. And so, like in the late '90s, and so his program at that point was all in person. There really wasn't any, the internet wasn't good enough back then for streaming or anything like that, right? Um, and it's funny because I was in the room with some other people, including a couple of physicians, like who really knew their health side really well. I was the one who knew the plant side really well. So like David would mention health conditions or that sort of thing, and it would be all new to me, exciting but
Mhm.
new. Whereas he would mention a plant, I'm like, I know that plant. This is really cool. Like, what can I do with it? That's really interesting. So it was an interesting perspective to bring to it on that level. But absolutely, of course, I had been aware for a long time, just being interested in plants of, yes, there are medicinal uses to the plants and all that. And but it was that year that I was living in Arkansas that I met my first real live herbalist. She was an herbalist midwife, and then she was part of that road trip up to this gathering in Iowa. And yeah, that just opened it all up for me in a way that I didn't even realize existed.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I was curious about that because in your bio you said that I think you started in 1999, but by like 2003, you're a registered herbalist, if I'm remembering that correctly. And I was like, whoa, he must have done something that really, because that's no small thing to become a registered herbalist with the American Herbalist Guild. Like the practitioner training is really intense, and then the process of that. So I was like, I wonder what happened that put him on that track, like in such a like straight way. Now I get it. That was David Winston's practitioner program. Yeah.
Yes, yeah, absolutely, which I'm still so fortunate for, and I teach a lot for him now, so I feel very privileged to be able to be doing that, and that's gradually increased over the years. But yes, it was sort of okay, dive into the deep end and go for it. And once I engaged with it, I really engaged with it in that sense for sure.
Mm. Well, thank you so much for sharing your story. And I am always curious. I'm always excited to see, like, we invite someone to the podcast, and I'm excited to see what herb that they're going to choose. And you have chosen one of my favorite herbs, and an herb that I think is so underrated. An herb that I used to like personally just kind of underrate because there's not a ton of information in Western herbalism about it. Um, Sometimes it's just so generalized. Self-heal, heal all. It heals everything. That's like you'll see that. Like you really see that in like older herbal books. It heals everything. Okay. Well, what does that mean? So I'm excited to hear why you chose self-heal and excited to hear more about self-heal from you.
Yeah, absolutely. And let's have a conversation about it because I hope you don't mind me sharing this, like in the lineup to come in for after your invitation to join here. There was some messaging of like, try not to pick an obvious herb because some things we just keep getting over and over. There was some language. I was like, okay, I'm going to pick one of the herbs I feel like, just as you said, is kind of undervalued in a lot of the herbal community, but that I love to use and talk about. And, different things come to mind. Mulberry was like a close runner up, for instance. But self-heal, and just to say, I went back afterwards, and I know that you've talked on your podcast about self-heal too. So again, would love to like have a back and forth here about it. But just as you're saying, it's so underrated, particularly outside of those herbal practitioners that come from an Eastern Asian tradition, whether that's their ethnic heritage or that's their training. In that case, the herb is part of the materia medica. But what's interesting to me about self-heal, and of course we're talking about Prunella vulgaris, and we can get more into the botany and everything like that too, as much as you like, but is that in terms of, as you say, Western herbalism, and I'd love to deconstruct the term Western
Please.
herbalism if you don't
Yeah,
mind,
yeah,
but
no, please do.
yeah, we
I'm like
can put
just
it to the
trying to
side.
like separate it from, because like you said, Eastern
Yeah,
herbalism has a very like this is part of their materia medica. They use it so much. So,
totally.
yeah.
Totally. Yeah, but we can put that to the side and circle back to it if you like.
Okay.
But I think it brings up interesting conversation to talk about those terms. But in any event, one of the things about self-heal in particular that I find so interesting is that most herbalists, and again, let's say herbalists outside of that Eastern Asian tradition, but most herbalists in the herbal community in the United States as we know it, right, know the plant and will point it out on herb walks like they know the plant, right? But don't really use it. Like you look at like formulas herbalists are using, or like talking about certain energetic disharmonies or patterns, or like what do you do for this, or in that kind of situation, and it like doesn't come up that often. People aren't really using it, so it's an interesting dichotomy between how much people recognize the plant and point it out and are familiar with it and appreciate it for its beauty and for its presence, but don't actually use it clinically or medicinally, right? So that's an interesting, not quite paradox, but contrast that I find. That was part of my motivation in bringing it up, and why, probably like you, I like to proselytize about it, right? I like to talk about it. It's because it's all over. It's just all around us. And one of the interesting things about the plant itself is that a lot of people don't realize this. It is native to here, to North America. So it often gets described mistakenly as a European herb that came over with colonization and wasn't here previous to that. And in fact, there's two different subspecies, and there's one that's native here and one that's native to Europe, Eurasia more broadly, not just Europe. And so, like yarrow and some other plants, we're realizing that what a lot of the 19th and 20th century in particular characterized as non-native isn't actually always accurate. So this plant has been here for who knows how long, and there are little ways you can distinguish between the subspecies that's native and the subspecies that's Eurasian. Not that ultimately it matters in a sense. If it's here, right? And they're used the same way, but that can be interesting to those of us who are kind of get more into the botanical geekery of things, and the shape of the leaf in particular is the main thing that you look at. But in terms of uses, I mean, should we talk a little bit about how I think about
Yes, yes, please.
self-heal and how to use it? Yeah. So if you look at it from a European tradition, just like you're saying, what you often see, like you look up John Gerard. I kind of like Gerard's herbal. He was like Shakespearean time English, or I'm sure you know, but just for anyone listening, Shakespearean contemporary, more or less, herbalist in England. And yeah, kind of like you're saying, he says like it's good for healing wounds. Use it topically, use it internally. But the thing is, it's a styptic, it's somewhat astringing, it helps to control bleeding and regulate bleeding. And for recovering from injury, from wounds, it has some antiseptic properties, so you can make a wash of it and use it topically. Of course, you can incorporate it into salves and creams and ointments too, but you can just use it in kind of a first aid sense. And internally, like if somebody, say, wants to get my advice about recovering from surgery, let's say, which is something that comes up. One herb that I often think of is gotu kola, but self-heal is and should be often right up there for the herbs we might recommend to somebody for recovering from surgery, which is a intentional injury. You can think of it as in many ways, right? So as a vulnerary, self-heal is often overlooked compared to other vulneraries we have. And again, for something that is everywhere and beautiful, not hard to find, not hard to grow, we should be using it more often. And then looking to the Chinese tradition of how to use self-heal. And it's the same species, again, maybe, arguably a different subspecies, but same plant. And that's good to know because there also are a lot of plants in the Eastern Asian Materia Medica that are closely related, but not exactly the same. And in some cases overlap really well with local plants we have. In other cases, like slow down, maybe not, right? So you have to be careful with that. But when it's the same species, that's where the botany comes in and can be helpful. One of the ways the botany can come in and be helpful is like, no, same plant, we're good. Although slightly different part of the plant, well, slightly different stage at which the plant is harvested, which we could talk about in traditional Chinese medicine. But it's an herb that clears heat. Is the main way it would be characterized. So we might refer to that as cooling. I've come to appreciate, even just in the last couple of years, what's more important than cooling, and we maybe want to be careful with too much cooling, is to recognize when we need to clear heat, which is not always the same as cooling. Like someone might actually be cold in some ways, but there's a stuck, trapped heat at the same time. And you don't want to cool that person down, but you somehow want to clear the heat. And self-heal is wonderful for that. So we can circle back to that, but just say the other main thing that it's used for is for softening hardnesses and masses, tumors, what in air quotes Western herbalism might be called a lymphatic, fairly enough, but self-heal is right up there with violet leaf and red clover, herbs we might think about cleavers more quickly than self-heal. But I find self-heal so helpful when you want to have that action in a formula of getting things dispersed and broken up and moving and cleared. It has that kind of action. So it doesn't really have like a nourishing action. So part of combining herbs is knowing, when someone needs to be nourished versus cleared, and often it's both. So then you can combine herbs in the right way that you make sure with foods and with lifestyle, right? And I'm not a fan of the term lifestyle, but we're stuck with it. To have that right balance of what somebody needs, right? So self-heal has a bitter flavor, it has a salty flavor, a little bit of an acrid flavor. And that kind of reflects what it does. The bitter is clearing the heat and draining downward. So when heat is rising up to the head and to the eyes, liver fire and liver yang rising, for folks who are knowledgeable about Chinese medicine and energetics, but we could deconstruct that a little bit, or dig more into that. But then the salty flavor, which is dissolving masses and tumors, and the acrid flavor, which is dispersing, right? So it kind of gives you a little window in what the herb does. So I think with any of that I just kind of briefly summarized, we could dig into a lot more detail.
Yeah, all of that's excellent. Um, since I've fallen in love with self-heal, and the way I fell in love with it is I had people asking me to write a monograph on self-heal, and I was like, well, it just doesn't grow near me. So it's just not something I use a lot, but okay. And I just did a kind of I did a lot of research on it, and then I became fascinated, and now it grows all over my garden because I have put it there.
Yeah.
And it has become a staple in my wound salves. I often do a plantain yarrow self-heal wound salve, or something like that. So it was great to hear that from you. Just like, yep, that's it. And then I do tend to like be more of on the lymphatic side, or dissolving those. But yeah, I think it's just a really underrated lymphatic. It was interesting to hear you say you don't think of it as a nutritive one, because I haven't thought of it like that. But I wonder, like, would you consider cleavers a nutritive lymphatic? And would you like consider pairing them as being kind of like you were saying, as like a crossover of different aspects?
Yeah, it's interesting. I see what you're saying. Cleavers definitely has a gentler spirit to it, right? I guess what I meant more by that, and it's interesting to again deconstruct like the semantics of it, because ultimately anything that helps you is is nourishing in some way, right? Like it's getting you to where you need to go. But what I meant more by that with self heal, I think, is like this kind of clearing activity. I do think cleavers or violet leaf, red clover, particularly as infusions,
Mhm.
have a little bit more nutritive value to them than, say, figwort or self heal or red root as lymphatics. But part of that too gets into the energetics, where often if somebody is experiencing a lot of heat rising to the surface, and heat rises, so it often rises to the head, kind of vasodilative, liver headaches of behind the eyes, and visual disturbances, and kind of sensitivity to sound and to light, is like feeling frustrated and irritable and on edge, and sometimes blood pressure goes up with that. That's all like liver fire or liver yang rising. And the thing to look for with those kinds of patterns is often that person will be yin depleted, so you've got yin and yang out of balance, and this is helping to like clear all of that heat, but it's not helping to nourish yin as much,
See,
right?
yeah.
Whereas like violet leaf, I think, does
Mhm.
cover that more. Chrysanthemum flower, which can be
Mm,
paired with self heal really well, does that a bit more. But then you can also just formulate, right? It doesn't mean don't use it. It just means like, oh, I know what I need to combine this with uh, uh, to address, that imbalance, right? So this has much more of that alterative, clear it out, move it out, get it moving, get it flowing again kind of energy to it, versus like the build somebody back up and rejuvenate them, right?
see.
Yeah, so you just throw in the right herbs to do that. Fresh milky oats or night blooming cactus or shatavari, or it all depends on the person. But there's plenty of herbs we could choose that work that way. But that's kind of what I was getting at with that, if that makes sense to you.
This has made me think of something that is a little bit of a side, but I'm just going to dive into it anyway. So I get those headaches. I'm kind of like your pitta headache person, especially when it's hot. And then I get, dehydrated, but it's not just a dehydration. I mean, I feel like it's that like lack of yin, but then this heat is rising and I have to, anyway. So the best thing that I have found for this, um, is ice cream. I'm not joking. This has been
Hmm.
like, I tell people this is like my best head for this type of headache. It's only my husband's homemade ice cream, which uses coconut milk, and there's coconut milk, a little bit of salt, and then some kind of like fruit. And then it's like frozen, of course. So it's very like simple ingredients. But I've known that the ice cream is like literally like, because when I get those types of headaches, I'm like, my mouth is dry and hot. Like I feel dry and hot. So ice cream is a good one there, but I can just see that like coconut milk as being like this incredibly just as you described it, it's also like replenishing. Like it's not just clearing the heat. There's like a nutritive replenishment that's going on, that's restoring that. So I just had this like other like I'm like, as you're speaking, I'm like, oh, that's why the ice cream works so well for that headache. Especially, I have tried store-bought ice cream with just like regular dairy. It's not the same. It's kind of, I don't know. I'm not saying it wouldn't work for anybody, but it's just something about the homemade coconut based ice cream that's just more cooling. But I've had that headache and have taken ibuprofen for it and just didn't even touch it. And then the ice cream is the one thing that's like, so I call it my ice cream deficiency headache.
I like that.
So, which is, I say it kind of jokingly, but it does help. It's the one thing that like really helps. So
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me, because if somebody is yin depleted, in terms of nutrition and broad food categories, it's fats that often speak to what somebody needs. It's, I'm always going to look to like what is whether someone's on a plant-based diet or animal plant-based mix, like we can solve those things easily if we're flexible enough and get good healthy fats in. That's our most yin nourishing category of foods, beyond drinking enough water, right? But that
right.
doesn't always do it. If somebody
Yeah.
comes to us dehydrated, that's easy, like drink water. But yeah, so that makes a lot of sense to me that would be helpful. And it's interesting because one of the things when I'm teaching energetics, I like to share with students after we get past like the basics level for people who are totally new to it, like what the heck are you even talking about kind of level, and you let that settle in and repeat it and work with it and kind of it's nice to take your time with those things and not try to rush it, because it can feel very abstract and weird if you try to rush it and become just a thing of memorization that doesn't actually make a lot of sense. But digging down a little deeper, one of the things that is really common is that yin deficiency with empty heat, or sometimes it's called false heat or vacuity heat. And the metaphor, and I didn't make this metaphor up, but I use it a lot, is it's kind of like a forest that has become so dry it's prone to igniting into forest fire. And you can keep putting out the fire, but the drought is actually the underlying disharmony. So you have to address the drought if you want to get past just putting out fires all the time. And
very poignant analogy for our times, Richard. I
oh
use
my
the car
gosh.
oil analogy, but this one's like living in the West here. It hits home.
Yeah, absolutely. And so there are some herbs that do that all on their own. Like I mentioned, chrysanthemum flower or white peony root in Chinese medicine, renowned for like clearing heat but nourishing yin at the same time. That's like a nice trick. So self-heal, back to self-heal, doesn't do the yin nourishing part, but that's okay, because again, we formulate. We just know if that's what's going on. We just need some yin nourishing foods. Eat your ice cream, and yin nourishing herbs, and yin nourishing activity in someone's life is equally important, I think, too.
You're saying I should go be in the hammock right now. Is that what you're saying? It's like hammock
I
time.
think so. Yeah, maybe wait till we're done. Unless we're done
Oh,
now,
right.
you
No,
can
no,
go
no,
for
no, no,
it.
no. I have more questions.
Yeah.
Beginning with, how do you like to work with self-heal in terms of preparations?
Yeah, so it does work its way nicely into topical remedies, like you mentioned. You can make an infused oil and then incorporate that into salves and so on, and that works well. I do use the tincture a lot as the dried herb. You can use an infusion or decoction, which would be the traditional Chinese way to prepare it. And I should say I should pause because I have some here besides me that I picked. It's flowering all around my house, and you'll see the blurry version because of this video that we have. But just such a gorgeous, beautiful plant, just stunning. And because you have it in your garden, that like a lot of weeds, quote unquote, right? It can be very small if it's in your lawn, but then you transplant that or let it grow in good soil and kind of keep competition down around it, and can get quite a bit bigger. Rather than a small weed in your lawn, it can become a foot or a foot and a half tall, or even a little bit taller than that at times. And just stunning. I think stunningly gorgeous plant, and in the Lamiaceae family, mint family. Anyway, we can get into that more, but I do use the tincture a lot as well. So tincturing it works quite well, and I tend to tincture it fresh. So like this is a perfect time to, what I would do with this, for instance, is you could just tincture this whole thing, but what's a little bit more effective is if you strip off these leaves and the flowering top, and don't tincture the stem with it. There's nothing wrong with including the stem, but stem material, with some exceptions, is biochemically more inert in plants. Stems really are there to provide cellulose-based structure to hold a plant up vertically, and also all the vasculature to move things back and forth. So we sometimes use stems in our medicine, but it can be more potent if you strip that off. And just tincture the leaf and flower. And in Chinese medicine, traditionally, they actually use the fruiting spikes. So I know you know this, but for anyone who isn't aware, just botanically, a fruit refers to what the flower transforms into once it's been fertilized, once it's been pollinated and the eggs have been fertilized. So fruit doesn't mean something fleshy and even safety necessarily in a botanical sense, but it's just whatever's in a flowering plant and an angiosperm protecting that seed as it matures. And so the fruit spikes later in the season are actually what's used more in Chinese medicine. There's some indications from some of the science that's out that including the leaf material is maybe more effective for when hypertension is part of the picture of what's going on. So not any kind of high blood pressure, because hypertension is something that isn't really a thing. It's an outcome of something else. So you have to figure out, what is it that's driving that blood pressure up? And if it is that liver fire, liver yang rising kind of pattern, then this can be tremendously effective. But we can use it, in other words, in both of those stages in different ways.
You prefer to use it more in the flowering stage than in the fruiting stage yourself?
I do. I
Yeah.
do. And that might, I will admit, it might be just an emotional preference.
That's kinda how I feel. Like, when you order it from a Chinese medicine source and it comes like this like brown material, it's just like a different feeling than, something when you dry it fresh and it's still so vibrant looking, or using it in fresh in a tincture. There's just, yeah. But
It's
I
true.
can't say that Chinese medicine is wrong. There's thousands of years they've got on me. So I'm not saying it's wrong. It's just it's a hard one to pivot on, I think.
Yeah, and some people mistakenly, they look at those brown spikes from a Chinese herb shop, and of course you have to get it from a good source, just like anything, right? But think, oh my God, this is so brown, like this is crappy quality.
Like it's a
It's
mistake.
important. Yeah, it's important to keep in mind it's not the dried flowers, it's post stage, so it is brown. Like it's not, it is supposed to look like that. So that's one thing. Sometimes if you go in thinking this is dried flowers, you just think, oh my gosh, what is this? So it's just at a later stage
Yeah.
that it's harvested.
Well, another thing in Chinese medicine is the dosage. I mean, dosage in Chinese medicine tends to be much larger than, I'll do the quotes, Western herbalism. But like Bensky, if I remember right, it's like they're recommending up to like 180 grams a day as an infusion, which is a lot. But that was kind of my preference. I was like, oh, I just want to use this as an infusion. I want to use it as a tea. I'm not sure that a tincture, you can really get the benefits from a small dosage tincture. But I have kind of come around to that partly because it's just really hard to get that much of it. Even growing it in my garden, like I harvest all that I can, and there's no way that I can get that amount that I could drink the tea regularly. I wouldn't really attempt 180 grams a day myself, but even to get like a 28 grams a day it'd be tough to do that. And it's not really available in commercial either. Like a lot of places don't carry it as much. So I've come to appreciate the tincture more as kind of like this is the option. And you've given us an incredible tincture recipe that is so detailed and really shows how to make fresh herb tincture. So people can download their own copy of this at the show notes at herbswithrosaleepodcast.com. Very extensive. My question that I had when looking at it is that you are calling for 35% alcohol. And
Mhm.
I was curious about that.
Yeah. And the reason, so this is part of the answer. And forgive me, I have this thing that I do often of like not quite answering the question directly and saying something else first and then going back.
Yeah,
But it's
we're here for
just
it.
the way, yeah. But just to say, part of why I wanted to give that much detail in the instructions was because, and herbalists differ on this, so I'm not trying to start a fight or anything. But it's fine. We all have different approaches. But often when making tinctures with fresh herbs, herbalists don't always account for, and again, we're talking about fresh herb, the fact that most of this is water, right? So the analogy I make is that most of you is water, most of me is water, right? Like if we dehydrated ourselves, you need a bigger dehydrator for that to work. You would be a third of your weight or a fourth of your weight, right? So it's the same thing with this. This is mostly water. So one of the things that can happen when fresh tinctures are made is that it's not always exacting enough, and you can end up with much lower alcohol percentage than what you think you were doing, because you're not accounting for the fact that it's mostly water. So like and I know that in the herbal community often we talk about folk tinctures versus not, and I've just recently in the past year or so kind of thought about I want better language for that, and so I this is clunky. I'll probably maybe somebody listening or yourself will come up with better wording, but I now talk about like measured tinctures versus unmeasured tinctures, and it takes the emotion out of the whole thing, because herbalists can get very emotional about that, and it's all folk medicine as far as I'm concerned. If we can make it in our kitchen, it's folk medicine. So in any event, measured versus unmeasured, and what I've seen sometimes happen when you don't measure, if you start out with something like vodka, that's 40% or maybe 50% alcohol, right? Something 80 proof, for example, or thereabout, and you tincture something fresh that has a really high water content like chickweed, it can actually go bad. I've seen people's tinctures go bad on them because what they aren't taking into account is how much water is in there. So they don't actually have a 40% tincture. They might have a 20% tincture, alcohol, 20% alcohol tincture. So when I say 35% alcohol, that's the end result.
The end result, I see.
Including the alcohol in the water, and excuse me, including the water already present in the herb as it's growing, and that's important to distinguish too. And it's often something when I'm evaluating somebody else's tinctures, and again, it's not meant to judge what's better or worse necessarily, but just to figure out, like if I have a client in my practice who says, oh, I make my own tinctures, or oh, I'm getting my tinctures over here, I have probably 3 or 4 or 5 questions I want to ask just to like arrive at what is my advice going to be about what dosage to take, or do I think that works or not? And so a lower alcohol percentage, like 35%, and again, that's describing the final result, not what you're adding to it, but the final result of what will be in your bottle, your jar as you're macerating, and then your bottle after you press it. That would be appropriate for an herb where there's more water-soluble constituents in it. So One of the things that is helpful about varying the alcohol percentage in the tinctures we make is that you could choose a middle of the road alcohol percentage, like 40 or 50%, and you'll capture a lot. That will work for a lot of things. But there are things on one end below that and the other end above that that aren't going to be ideal if you stick to that for everything you're tincturing. And the more there are polar constituents, i.e. water-soluble constituents that constitute the bulk of the medicine we're trying to extract, you might want an alcohol percentage that's a little bit lower than that. So like hawthorn would be another example of an herb where I would use a lower percentage of alcohol like this. Whereas something really, as an example, resinous, like calendula, cannabis, right? Things that are really resinous, resins themselves, like myrrh, for instance, you're not going to get as effective a medicine using that middle of the road alcohol percentage that you would if you bumped it up higher and use pure alcohol or 80% or 90%. So that's the idea behind using a lower percentage. And of course, there's room for all sorts of differing opinions in the herbal world too, because part of it is also you just, maybe by changing the alcohol percentage in a tincture or how you're preparing the plant any other way, using a decoction on the stovetop versus whatever, right? You might just be getting like a somewhat different flavor of that herb, right? Like you might be extracting, it's not always better or worse, but it's sometimes, oh, that's a little different because you're pulling something different from the plant that way. Anyway, that's the very long-winded explanation of that. And the details in the recipe are about accounting for the fact that this is probably 3/4 water. And if you wanted to be very nerdy and geeky about and exacting about it, and if you have a dehydrator, what you can do is the day before you're going to make tincture, you could take a sample of 10 grams or 20 or 30 grams of the herb and weigh it. That's how you know that it's that amount, and then dry it and see what it weighs, and then that tells you exactly how much water was in it. But estimates are pretty good. It's going to get you pretty darn close and good enough too. But anyway, that's the reasoning behind all that.
Yeah, that's excellent, and thank you so much for all of those details, both here and in the handout.
Sure, absolutely.
Is there anything we haven't covered about self-heal that you want to cover?
Oh, well, I mean, there are definitely things we mentioned that we didn't dig into the details of, like as a lymphatic that dissolves masses and tumors. It's good for cysts, ovarian cysts, benign breast cysts. It's also used in a lot of cancer protocols. There's some evidence, at least, that's growing that it has some actual anti-cancer activity, might be helpful in inducing cell death of cancer cells, apoptosis, or other means by which it's impeding the reproduction of cancer in the body. Either way, as an adjunct, or does it really address the cancerous growth itself at the same time? Might be doing a bit of both. It's used in a lot of those protocols. Helpful for hyperthyroidism in many cases, which is very much like a fiery yang state. Sometimes that also includes nodules or goiter. So there's that link too. So there's more detail in kind of what we spelled out about self-heal for sure, where I would think, oh, this is a helpful herb. And sometimes without all those things, honestly, just when somebody is like kind of livery and easily frustrated and kind of on edge and irritable. We think of anger as associated with the liver, but anger is not always what resonates with somebody to describe how they're feeling. I find frustrated often, because frustration can lead to anger, but doesn't always lead to anger. It's sort of like one step behind it, I think. So even on the emotional level, that's how I would think of self-heal too, which frustration, right? When something's frustrated, it's stopped, right? It's like, it's blocked. So going back to what we were saying in the beginning, an herb with this energy of like, break it up, dissolve it, let it move again, clear it out, right? That's the kind of energy you need if you're feeling like stuck and frustrated about things and on edge and irritable and, oh, the light, the sounds, oh, the people, right? All of that. So those are a few things I would add to how I think about it.
Thank you for that. I'm never frustrated. I'm always cool as a cucumber. Just kidding. That's kind of like that is my thing.
You,
But
you said pitta before, so it's like, really, really.
but that is an interesting distinction because I don't think of myself as an angry person. Like I rarely get angry, but I will get frustrated, and that's kind of like my indication. I'm like, oh, it's time to go see my 5-element acupuncturist. Like when everything is frustrating, I'm like, it's time to go. I'm gonna think more about self-heal during those times as well.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
Have you worked with it at all as a skin protectant? That's something that I've really leaned into using it for.
Do you mean for like antioxidant? It's chock full of antioxidants. So is that
Yeah,
what you're thinking of
yeah,
mostly?
yeah. So, again, just making it all about me. I loved to get a lot of sun when I was younger, and so now I feel like one of the important roles I can play for my skin is like preventive care. And so,
Mhm.
of course, I think of calendula, which I use a lot. But when I was studying self heal, and I came across that as just being a wonderful plant for helping post sun exposure. Now I try to limit the sun I get, but I think there's a lot we can do to just like keep restoring our skin health over and over again. So it's one that I've been infusing into oil and using, I infuse it into like a jojoba or apricot kernel oil, something that's light, and then I put it on at night often, just let it soak in throughout the night. Yeah.
That sounds great. No, that sounds excellent. It makes total sense to me to use it that way, and bumping up antioxidants in your foods and herbs you take internally in a background way as well, which I'm sure you're keyed into, but is also really helpful both with our herbs and with our foods. But that makes complete sense to me that it would be helpful that way.
Yeah, right now I'm just my own single study on this, so it'd be great for more people to start trying it as well and reporting back.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, thank you for sharing so much about self-heal. I love that you love self-heal. It's fun, like, to meet, like fellow self-heal admirers. So it's lovely. Um, I'd love to hear about projects you have going on. I know you're faculty at David Winston. You also have your own school. You also have other things going on. So, for people who are like, I want to learn more from Richard, where do they find you? What do they learn?
Oh, thank you so much for asking that. So yes, I teach for David, and I'll see you there, and which is wonderful. And there's a small team of us now who do that. So there's a few other instructors along with David who are teaching the program, and that's a 2-year program. And then, as you mentioned, about a decade ago or so, a little bit longer than that now, I co-founded the Arbor Vitae School of Traditional Herbalism with Claudia Keel. I no longer direct the school. A couple years ago, I stepped back from the admin side of that, but still do a lot of the core teaching along with her and many other teachers. And that's a hybrid in-person online program in the Hudson Valley in New York State. And then I do, especially in the summer, those things keep me busy. I do some other teaching here and there, like I'm teaching a couple courses for an acupuncture school, which I do every summer. I'm not an acupuncturist, but I teach botany and biochemistry of plants, phytochemistry for them. But I do, particularly in the summer, for folks who are closer to my neck of the woods, which is the Southern Catskills part of New York, do a lot of all-day plant walks and herb walks, some of them in New York City, some of them up closer to where I am. And so folks could check that out on my website, which is just my name, richardmandelbaum.com, and see if they're interested in that. One other thing, just to mention that if I can, a project that I'm super excited about
Please
right
do.
now,
Yeah.
which I am playing a peripheral supportive role in. I want to be really clear. You probably know Margie Flint, I'm guessing.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, I know the project you're talking about, I
Oh,
think.
you do? Good. Yeah, the William Lasassier
Yeah.
project. So I was super lucky after I had studied with David and this was with Claudia Keel, who arranged a study group for William. It was just, 6 to 8 of us sitting around learning from him. Incredibly fortunate to be in the right place at the right time, looking back on it all now, because that was leading up to his passing, which I didn't know at the time. And just a phenomenal herbal genius in general. And so there's this project to turn his teachings into books, because people have learned from him all over the herbal community, or learned from people who've learned from him, or have notes scribbled in their own notebooks from 20 years ago when they took a class or whatever it is. And how do we save all that and pass it on? And so there's this tremendous effort underway that people can either donate to because it's all grassroots fundraised, or also there's some seeking right now of people for actually some limited hired positions to help out with transcribing and consolidating and putting those into book forms. And several of us are going to help like review drafts, and it sounds like you're involved in that too. It's very, very exciting because a lot of folks know his name or even don't know his name, but are benefiting from all the wisdom he passed down. So to be able to preserve that is really important. So just to key people into all of that is something I'd like to share for sure.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. It's I'm so glad that's being done. And it's interesting. I feel like in the past couple of years there's been a big movement towards doing this like posthumous publication of stuff, like Christopher Headley and his partner, who I'm escaping my name, but there's a couple books of theirs that was published posthumously. I heard there's one being worked on for Cascade Anderson Geller, the William Lasassier. So that's really wonderful. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, before I let you go, I have one last question for you. And the last question for you, Richard, is how has herbalism surprised you?
Mm. Yeah, in so many ways. Like I said earlier, I didn't even start out on this realizing it would be a life path for per se. Like I do plant walks now, or botany classes, or just this past Saturday I was out on the water in this marshland wetland that's near me, leading a kayak, canoe, herb paddle. We were studying the
Fun.
aquatic plants all day, and just to look back and realize like all the time I put in just for my own passion, and now can share and pass down. That's certainly one thing that's total surprise, unplanned, which is often the best way for things to unfold. But I would say probably the biggest answer to that question for me is the people, the human beings, because for me, it's really the foundation of why I'm doing all of this is uh, a continual seeking and reinforcing of my intimacy with the plants and with the planet, especially again in like a larger culture that's so alienating and disassociating. So I feel like it's a constant effort. So that's like the foundation for me, is just to be out there with the plants. But there's part of me that's more uh, of an introvert. I wouldn't say antisocial, because I really love being social actually, but I could picture myself like on some alternate path, just like out there as this weird hermit, like gathering the herbs, and I think what I never anticipated and has surprised me so much and really keeps me in it in terms of both teaching and practicing, which really make up the bulk of what I do day to day, is one or the other, um, uh, is the wonderful people that you just encounter on this path. And it's like, I mean, I I believe that the vast majority of human beings are wonderful people, right? Like it's not that it's special to herbalism, yet I think I think it's fair to say, I'd be curious what you think, that there's like this natural filter of people who are plant people. I mean, it includes like botanists who don't know much about the medicinal uses, but certainly in the herbal world, both people who come to me in my practice, people who want to study it, people you just run into and meet who are passionate about it in one way or the other as well. It's like this natural filter where you can be pretty darn confident it's going to be like good people who are just fun to hang out with and interesting. And yeah, I don't know a better word for it than simply like good folks. And that's not anything that was ever on my radar or that I anticipated, but that I continually kind of come back to and I feel like holds me in the community space in this wonderful way. Yeah, I think, I mean, anyone watching this is probably already there to some degree, but if you want to just kind of filter out the noise a little bit and find good folks, this is a pretty darn good way to do it, I think.
It is, and that's such a great, a great call to for people who, to look for local herbalists in your area, to go on plant walks, to go on a kayak. That sounds amazing. A kayak paddle for aquatic plants, to go do this, to go to conferences. I mean, every time I go to conferences, I'm just always blown away by just the amazing people there. And I was in Italy this year with Rosemary Gladstar on a herbal retreat, and all the people there were just so fantastic. And I often tell people it's like we were in this 1,000-year-old castle, and like I often didn't have water, or if I did, it was just freezing cold water. And the high was 50 a day, in the 50s, and I didn't care. I was like just surrounded by such great people. I was just like, yeah, whatever. So I'm taking a freezing cold shower. It's cool. I'm with cool people. So
Yeah.
yeah, I really resonate with that a lot, and really recommend for folks to, to get out there and spend time with plant folks.
Absolutely. And like you're saying, the larger conferences, it's like there's all these concentric circles. Find the people right near you in your neighborhood or in your town or in your community, but then like keep, you want to expand it too. And that can be a beautiful thing, just to realize that, oh, as an individual, I'm not isolated in this. I'm not alone in this. And then even as my local community, we're not alone in this. And it just keeps expanding outward that way. And there's a real grounding and comfort, I think, that comes from that as well.
That's so well said. Well, that has been a lot of the podcast for me too. It's been such an honor to interview people and get to know people. Sometimes I know the people well, sometimes not as well. And I would say you are no exception, Richard. It's been absolutely fabulous to spend some time with you, hear your perspectives, and hear your wisdom about self-heal.
Thank you so much. This has been a pleasure, and I look forward to running into you and taking a walk or having a cup of tea or whatever makes sense at the moment.
I'm looking forward to that too. Thanks, Richard.
Thank you. Take care.
As always, thank you so much for being here. Don't forget to head over to the show notes at herbswithrosaleepodcast.com to download your beautifully illustrated recipe card and to get a transcript of this show. There you'll also be able to sign up for my weekly newsletter, which is the best way to stay in touch with me. You can find more from Richard at richardmandelbaum.com. If you'd like more herbal episodes to come your way, then one of the best ways to support this podcast is by subscribing on YouTube or your favorite podcast app. I deeply believe that this world needs more herbalists and plant-centered folks, and I'm so glad that you're here as part of this herbal community. Also, a big round of thanks to the people all over the world who make this podcast happen week to week. Nicole Paul is the project manager who oversees the whole operation, from guest outreach to writing show notes to actually uploading each episode, and so many other things I don't even know. She really holds this whole thing together. Francesca is our fabulous video and audio editor. She not only makes listening more pleasant, she also adds beauty to the YouTube videos with plant images and video overlays. Tatiana Rusakova is the botanical illustrator who creates gorgeous plant and recipe illustrations for us. I love them. I know that you do too. Christy edits the recipe cards, and then Jenny creates them as well as the thumbnail images for YouTube. Alex is our tech support and social media manager, and Karen and Emily are our student services coordinators and community support. For those of you who like to read along, Jennifer is who creates the transcripts for us each week. Xavier, my handsome French husband, is the cameraman and website IT guy. It takes an herbal village to make it all happen, including you. One of my favorite things about this podcast is hearing from you. I read every comment that comes in, and I'm excited to hear your herbal thoughts on self-heal. Okay, you've lasted to the very end of the show, which means you get a gold star and this herbal tidbit. As Richard pointed out, self-heal is native to North America, and as a result, it has many relationships with beneficial pollinators. According to the website of Illinois Wildflowers, self-heal flowers are visited by long-tongued bees, short-tongued bees, small butterflies, and skippers. Bee visitors also include bumblebees and little carpenter bees and longhorn bees and halictid bees, including green metallic bees. So lots of the pollinators love those self-heal flowers. If you'd like to dive even deeper into this fascinating plant, then check out the interview I did with Carolyn Gagnon, as well as my own solo episode. I'll include links to those in the show notes.